Judy Cummings. I consider it both an honor and a privilege to stand behind this sacred desk, and I'm so grateful that you always just extend these gracious invitations, and you create space for me to preach and or lecture, and so for that, thank you. Amen. And then to Pastor and Deacon Cummings, this week on Wednesday actually was the 5th year anniversary of my dad's transition to eternal glory, and I couldn't help but to think about how when all of that happened 5 years ago, that the two of you drove from Tennessee to Illinois to check up on me and my family. And for that, you have a whole Johnson family that just completely adores both of you. To all of the elders, the deacons, the clergy, the ministry leaders, and to the congregation, I greet you in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And it brings me great joy today to see a childhood friend of mine in the congregation today. Chad Jones and his wife Yvette and their 2 daughters and a family friend who just recently realized that we actually live in the same state. So to see you and your family, thank you so much. On this Womanist Sunday, the title of our sermon is When the Wine Runs Out. The scripture comes from John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, which reads, on the 3rd day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, they have no more wine. Dear woman, why do you involve me? Jesus replied, my time has not yet come. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned to wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had so much to drink. But you have saved the best till now. This, the first of his miraculous signs, Jesus performed at Cana in Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him.
All right.
Won't you pray with me this morning? God, we invite you into this preaching moment. God, we ask that you will touch our ears so that we may hear you. God, we ask that you will touch our eyes so that we may see you. And God, we ask that you will touch our hearts so that we may receive the word that you have for us on this day. It's in Jesus' name that we pray and ask all these things. And all of God's children said, amen. My maternal grandmother, whom we all lovingly called Mother Dear, was a feisty little thing. She stood at almost 5 feet tall, and she was as lively, determined, and courageous as she wanted to be. Mother Dear's mom, Grandma Beulah, lived with her and her 4 kids. One day, when my mom was about 6 or 7 years old, my great-grandma Beulah decided that she was going to go out of town to visit some relatives for about 7 days, and these relatives lived in Mississippi. So Mother Dear dropped her off at the bus station and then proceeded to throw a party that lasted from the time she dropped her off until the time she picked her up. When Mom would go to school, the party was going on. When Mom would come home from school, the party was going on. When Mom would go to bed, the party was still going on. Mother Dear and her church friends would cook breakfast. But the lunch and the dinner, they would run together. And so around late afternoon, early evening, they would have this huge holiday spread type of meal just laid out for all to enjoy. Now, it was easy to keep the food and the wine going because the grocery store was just 1 block away from the house.
All right.
This party actually took place in 3 row houses. Aunt Ann's house was in the front, and then Aunt Addie's house was in the back. And Mother Dear's house was right smack in the middle.
Take the picture.
Aunt Ann's house and Aunt Addie's house were used as overflow and sleeping quarters. But Mother Dear's house was the show enough party house because her house was the heartbeat of the party.
Come on. All right.
According to my mom, the way this party got started was because when parents go away, the children play. And when my grandmother Beulah left for her trip, people came over and nobody wanted to go home because they were having such a good time.
Good time.
Parmalee and Sadie came over first, then Ann and Addie, then others started making their way to Mother Dear's house. It was essentially a get-together that never stopped. People would come and go in shifts because everyone had to go to work. These were all church folks. Mother Dear was the minister of music. So her choir members would come over and she would rock that piano while they sang gospel songs in her living room. Everybody knew the moment Mother Dear had to go pick up Grandma Beulah, the party would be over. They had to pack up food, wash dishes, put everything away because they needed to bury the evidence of their 7-day shindig. Although Mother Dear was living in her own house, paying her own bills and raising her own kids, she didn't want her mother to know that she had a party for 7 days straight. Unlike Mother Dear's party, when we look at the text, we see a party that was highly publicized. I know that many of us are already quite familiar with this text, but sometimes the simplest things can have the most profound meaning. What most of you may not know is that although the text takes us to Jesus by describing his very first miracle, this is really a story about Mary. It's a story about Mary's faith in the promises of God. In our text, there was a wedding going on in Cana. During those days, wedding feasts lasted 7 days, and weddings were a big deal. The bride and groom invited people from near and far to come and hang out with them for several days to celebrate their nuptials. The people would come and bring gifts for the couple while the couple and their parents would house and feed all the guests. Can you imagine having a wedding reception that lasted 7 days or 168 hours non-stop, sun up to sundown? The dancing, the feasting, the amount of drinking that must have gone on behind those walls had to have been insane. Mary, Jesus, and Jesus' disciples were all invited, but they didn't arrive until the 3rd day. Back then, CP time was acceptable. Since the reception lasted 7 days, new guests would arrive every day for your party with harder than you did the day before. I imagine imagine that the first 2 days, the party was jumping.
Yeah.
The couple had said their I do's. There was an abundance of food. The alcohol was flowing. The couple probably figured they would get a socialite write-up in the local Cana magazine. And I'm sure they were patting themselves on the back for having planned a successful party. But by the time day 3 rolls around, the story changes because now the party is in crisis mode.
All right.
The wine has run out. I'm not exactly sure what happened that the bride and groom ran out of wine. Maybe the people were partying too hard and ran out of wine and just blamed it on the alcohol. Or maybe there was a miscalculation in the amount of wine that was needed, and instead of placing an order that would last 7 days, they mistakenly placed an order that would only last 3 days. Whatever the reason, the situation was clear to Mary that the wine had run out. Mary jumped into her motherly fix-it mode because these were people that she loved, and she didn't want them to be humiliated over their inability to provide for their guests. Most of us wouldn't want to be shamed for the rest of our lives either. I'm sure that she noticed the whispering and growing embarrassment. The music stopped playing. People stopped dancing. Folks started to pack up and leave. Everybody knows that when the drinks run out, the party's over. Geographically speaking, Cana's pretty close to Nazareth. It's only 3.5 miles away. We already know that Mary had a close relationship with the bridegroom, but in my homiletical imagination, I can envision her walking 3.5 miles to spend time with the future bride, to give the bride pointers about married life and what to expect. I would like to think that she loved this future bride the same way that she loved her own children, because why else would she ask Jesus to get involved and fix the problem? What's important to note here is that Mary recognized there was a problem. This was a crisis that could have had some serious implications. The families of wedding couples could have been humiliated for the rest of their lives due to their inability to sufficiently provide for their guests. If the crisis could not be resolved, what implications would it have on the longevity of the newlyweds relationship? If we're being honest this morning, just about all of us need to admit that we too are in crisis mode because the wine has run out. We need to be like Mary and recognize the problem. That dream job that we prayed for has turned into a nightmare. The wine has run out. We thought that moving to a state that has no state income tax would be the answer to our financial prayers. But with the gentrification taking place all around Nashville, we're being priced out of our own neighborhoods. The wine has run out. We got health insurance so we can actually afford our medical care, but with the skyrocketing prices of the pharmaceutical industry, some medications have hit close to the $1 million mark, and people are literally draining their savings accounts and losing their houses in order to afford life-saving drugs. The wine has run out. It used to be safe walking out your front door. We didn't have to fear drive-bys. And there was a time when if we were ever pulled over, we didn't have to fear for our life. The wine has run out. There was a time when people were innocent until proven guilty, but now people are guilty until proven innocent because cases are tried in the court of public opinion. College degrees used to be worth the paper that they were printed on, all because colleges actually used to be diligent about only admitting the best. But now we find out through the largest college admission scandal that the rich are committing all kinds of mail fraud, bribery to purchase their kids' admission into college. The wine has run out. We live in a country that is quick to bail out big banks and slow to fix the Flint water crisis. We live in a country that is built on the backs of immigrants, and now 45 is threatening to close the Mexican border. We live in a country where truth and upstanding moral values have been replaced with alternative facts. Beloved, the wine has run out. We've got to wake up and see our problems for what they are, because we too are in crisis mode. We also need to realize, just like Mary did, that we can't fix this in our own strength. Mary understood that this time it was out of her reach.
Come on.
But then she did what we all need to do. She remembered the promise.
Yeah.
You see, Mary had to think back about 30 years and some months ago to the time when the angel Gabriel came to her and told her, "Do not be afraid. You have found favor with God. You will give birth to a son, and you are to name him Jesus.
All right.
He will be great, and he will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will have no end." Mary reached down into the sacred vault of her heart to take hold of a promise that had gone unfulfilled and lifted that up to God. Does anybody have any unfulfilled promises that have been spoken into your life? I'm sure there are many of us, including myself, who are walking around with unfulfilled promises that God whispered in our ears a long time ago. Maybe it was spoken into your life that God would bring you a helpmate, and that the two of you would do great things together, and you're still waiting on this spouse to appear. Maybe you were told that you would be an excellent entrepreneur one day, but you were still waiting for the business to come into fruition. Maybe it was prophesied that you are called to the ministry, but you are still waiting for God to stir up that love affair between you and Christ before you step out on faith and actually do anything. Or maybe it was prophesied that you would have kids one day, and you find yourself still yearning to be a parent because of an unfulfilled promise. Many of us have walked around with unfulfilled promises, and there is no shame in that, because God's timing is not our timing. We operate in chronological time, also known as sequential time, but God operates in kairos, perfect time. God may not come when you want, but God is always on time. And that's not to say that you won't ever have to tell God, "Look, you and I need to have a come to Jesus moment, because your timing is a little off." But what I've learned is that whenever God seems late in fulfilling a promise, God is really protecting me from unnecessary promises.
Yes, he is.
If you've ever had to wait on a promise, then you know what I'm talking about. Mary had to wait decades to see a promise get fulfilled. I can't imagine how Mary was able to hold a secret for that long. Granted, no one in Jesus' hometown thought of him as a religious man, and oddly enough, when Jesus began to gather disciples, not one Nazarene joined his movement to become a disciple of Christ. When people looked at Jesus, they saw an ordinary man, but when Mary looked at Jesus, she saw God's promise.
All right.
She already knew that Jesus was the Son of the Most High, because she would never be able to forget the immaculate conception of Christ. To have never known a man, and then for an angel to tell her that she was with child. And for her cousin Elizabeth's baby to leap for joy in Elizabeth's womb at the sound of Mary's pregnant voice. Whenever Mary looked at her son, she saw God's promise, and she knew that he was the Messiah that they had been waiting on. So what do you do when you are in a crisis and you are staring at your promise? Again, Mary was clearly aware that she could not do anything within her own power to create more wine. She recognized the crisis was too big for her to handle. Mary couldn't fix the problem herself, but she knew that she could turn to the one who could. And so she turns to Jesus. This is what prayer looks like when Jesus is literally standing right next to you in the flesh. We get to see and hear both sides of the conversation to understand how Mary's faith in God's promise brought about the miracle that they needed. Let me just point out for a second that the reason Mary is able to turn to Jesus is because Jesus was invited to the wedding. Some of us wait until we are in full crisis mode before we invite Jesus to take center stage in our lives. Thank God these newlyweds had enough sense to invite Jesus to the party before the crisis broke out. Some of us in here recognize that the crisis in our lives is too big for us to handle, and I just came by to remind you that it's time to turn to the one who can fix it. When Mary tells Jesus that they have no more wine, Jesus replies, "Dear woman, why do you involve me? My time has not yet come." Now, I don't know about you, but this tells me that even the Son of the Most High gets a little bit perturbed when his mother wants him to do something that he is not ready to do. More importantly, it shows that Jesus had enough smarts to recognize that when mama's not happy, nobody's happy. We've all been there. Mary said what she had to say, and I'm sure she didn't like the smart-aleck response that she got. So she does what any seasoned mother would do. She stops paying attention to her son and starts focusing her attention on the servant.
Come on.
Mary's belief in her promise is what convicted her to tell the servants, "Do whatever he tells you to do." Mary knew that they desperately needed a miracle, but at the same time, she knew that her son was a miracle because he represented God's promise. Sometimes we need people around us who can see things in us that we can't see in ourselves. Sometimes we need a person, a mother, a grandmother, or an aunt, or a sister to push us into our destiny. Some of you may be thinking, wait a second. Mary didn't exactly ask Jesus to get involved. She simply told him that they ran out of wine. Well, implicit in her statement to her son was her request for him to get involved and do something about it. Think back on when you were growing up and think back on what it meant for your mom or your grandmother to say, "We ran out of milk," or "We don't have any more eggs." They weren't just blowing hot air in your face. They were helping you to figure out that you had better fix that problem and go to the store to get the eggs or get the milk. After Mary informed Jesus of the crisis, Jesus quickly thought of a remedy. He told the servants, "Fill the 6 water jars with water." He was essentially telling them to use what they already possessed. So they fill the water jars to the brim. Sometimes when Jesus answers our prayers, and he'll ask us to do things that we don't necessarily understand, things that don't necessarily make sense to us. But it's in those situations where we just have to do what the servants did, and we just have to do whatever he tells us to do. Because the thing is that Jesus sees the beginning, the middle, and the end, whereas we can only see the present. It's in times like those that you've got to be like those servants and do whatever they say do. And each jar held 20 to 30 gallons of water. So we're roughly talking about 180 gallons of water. I can't imagine how many trips back and forth it took with these buckets of water for them to fill these 6 stone water jars. But I can imagine that at some point, doubt must have set in. They had to have wondered, Jesus, is this really going to work? And then to hear Jesus say to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. Here Jesus is asking the servants to exercise their own faith. Jesus is telling them to walk by faith and not by sight. Don't you know that fear will paralyze you from walking by faith? I can only imagine that whoever was chosen to draw the water out of the jar and present it as wine to the master of the banquet had to have been terrified. When they looked at what they were holding, it looked like water. Not only was this a crisis situation for the wine, it was a crisis situation for the servants, because if things went left, they could lose their jobs and become blackballed from the hospitality industry. Mary was already covering the servants in prayer, and I believe her faith was greater than their unbelief. Her faith covered them. So many times we ask people to cover us in prayer. Well, this is what it looks like. Whenever your faith gets shaky, as long as you have a strong person of faith covering you, you will make it from point A to point B. Because God is covering. The further you walk, the more solid your faith will become, because you will be able to look back and see just how far God has brought you. Somewhere between their unbelief and their walking by faith, a miracle happened. The master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned to wine. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now. Beloved, this wedding at Cana tells us in the simplest terms that when the wine runs out, our faith has the power to produce the miracle that we need. So what am I saying? I'm saying recognize the problem, remember the promise, pray, use what you already possess, and know that your faith has the power to produce the miracle that you need. Beloved, the wine has run out in our neighborhoods, and the wine has run out in this land of the free and home of the brave. We are not as free as we thought we were, and we are not as brave as we used to be. This is why we began the new year with a citywide movement of prayer and fasting called Awaken Nashville, which unified the church to strategically pray for every person in the greater Nashville area, because we recognize that we are living in perilous times. For God said, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and forgive their sins and heal the land. And we remembered that Jesus is the promise. Jesus told us a long time ago that the thief cometh not but for to steal and to kill and to destroy. I am come that they might have life and that they might have it more abundantly. With Awaken Nashville, we used what we already possessed. Our collective power to pray over the land. And then we used our voices as we put pen to paper to fill out our 15 postcards to let the individuals know that we had been praying for them. I believe because of our prayer and the fasting that our faith will produce the miracle that we need. I'm almost done. But I have to tell you the story about some dear friends of mine back at home, a husband and a wife, who wanted to get pregnant and prayed that they would have kids someday, but for whatever reason, they weren't able to conceive. One particular Sunday, when they went to church, there was a guest preacher who prophesied that they would have children. The couple got excited. They turned one of their bedrooms in their house into a nursery and waited and waited and waited. While they were waiting, they signed up to become foster parents to kids temporarily in need of a stable environment. They kept waiting, praying, and holding on to God's promise. About 10 years went by, and the wife was on the metro train, headed home from work, and she got a phone call that she wasn't expecting. The person on the other end of the phone told her, "Ma'am, you can come and pick up your child." The wife thought this was crazy, and she just knew that she was being punked because this was an odd thing for her to experience. And it actually took the person on the other end of the phone a long time to convince her that this was not a joke, and that it wasn't a joke, and it took them a long time to convince her that she really did need to come pick up this baby boy. So, she picked up the child, and after she picked up the child, she and her husband began the process to adopt this beautiful little bundle of joy. The adoption went through. The couple was ecstatic. But remember, the prophetess said, "You will have children," as in plural. So there's an S on it. Well, about a year later, they get another phone call. Come to find out that their son now has a biological baby sister. And the agency called them because they wanted to know if they would adopt the baby girl as well. Needless to say, the husband and wife are proud parents of a boy and a girl because their faith in God's promise produced the miracle that they need. So when the wine runs out, know that if you don't stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. If you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can speak to the mountain and it will move. Faith cometh by hearing and hearing by the word of God. Faith should not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. For Jesus is the author and the finisher of our faith. No eye has seen, no ear has heard, no human mind has conceived the things that God has prepared for those who love the Lord. Don't you know that something dead on Friday can come back to life? The Lord said, "Verily I say unto you, he or she that believeth in me, the works that I do, he or she shall do these also, and greater things than these." That's right. When the wine runs out, your faith will produce the miracle that you need.